Dr. Rhonda Patrick, what is possibly worse than smoking when it comes down to life expectancy?
Yeah, it's funny because we were talking about this a moment ago, and it sort of blew my mind to see some data. This is out of Bill Harris's group that looked at life expectancy and the omega-3 index, which is a really good way of measuring your omega-3 levels. Everybody knows smoking is bad for you, right? I mean, that's like common knowledge. Everybody knows that. However, when you look at life expectancy and you sort of stratify the data according to smokers and non-smokers, smokers with a high omega-3 index, in other words, they have high levels of omega-3, have the same life expectancy as non-smokers with low omega-3. And if you look at the data, there's this beautiful graph. The life expectancy curves overlay where those two are the same. And it's just kind of mind-blowing because not getting enough omega-3, not having a high omega-3 index, was as bad as smoking with respect to life expectancy. Now, a lot of people, when they think about smoking being bad, they think about, cancer. Smoking increases cancer and lung cancer, But that takes sort of decades to accumulate the kind of damage you need, to increase that risk of cancer. It's your cardiovascular health that's at high risk with smoking. And it's not a linear risk like cancer is. Like the more packs you get, under your belt, the more packs of cigarettes you get under your belt, the higher the cancer risk. But with risk of heart attack, risk of cardiovascular disease, it doesn't take as much. So it's one of those things where smoking really negatively affects cardiovascular health. And that's the actual thing that omega-3s are very beneficial for. So it's just kind of a mind-blowing way to think about, because I think this came out back in like 2009. It was a study out of Harvard. And I remember reading this study, and the headline was Top 6 Preventable Causes of Death. And these are things like, not smoking. That's a top preventable cause of death, right? Early death, early mortality. Hypertension, right? So avoiding hypertension. Those things were obvious. But what was up there was low omega-3 from marine sources. In other words, from fish, right? So there's omega-3, there's DHA, EPA. Those are from marine sources. And then there's ALA from plant sources. And it was from the fish that was identified as one of the top preventable causes of death. And that was very intriguing because it's like, that's an easy nutritional. Most people kind of think of things to avoid, things to cut out. But what you're not getting is, I like to focus on that. What are you not getting in your diet? And scientists from Harvard had attributed about 84,000 deaths a year to not getting enough omega-3. In other words, people that were having that low omega-3 index, predominantly from affecting cardiovascular related mortality, right? But what was also interesting was that the same number of deaths were attributed, so about 82,000 deaths a year, were attributed to eating trans fats. Again, everybody knows trans fats are not good for you, right? I mean, it's on every grocery shelf, that you walk into, it's like zero trans fat, right? You buy a bottle of water, it's like zero trans fat, right? But no one's thinking about that when they go into the grocery store. Oh, am I getting my fish today? Am I getting my omega-3 today? Because the same amount of deaths were attributed to not getting enough of that as for getting trans fats. So again, right, it's just a way of thinking about it where, and this is just like scratching the surface, so there's just been so much data. A lot of data have come out of Bill Harris's group, by the way. He now has a great research institute, the Fatty Acid Research Institute, which I'm an associate researcher, part of that institute, where we study a variety of different fatty acids, predominantly omega-3, and their effects on human health. And Bill's done a lot of great work. He is the co-inventor of the omega-3 index. And I like this because it's a biomarker of long-term omega-3 status. In other words, instead of looking at plasma phospholipids, where it's like, what did I eat in the last week? Did I eat fish? That's sort of reflective of more of like your recent diet. Whereas if you get and you measure omega-3 in your red blood cell membranes, those have a lifespan of roughly, it's like 120 days or something like that. So you're talking about a longer term omega-3 status, right? Very similar to like HbA1c versus fasting blood glucose.
That was going to be my question, was like, how long would it take someone to change their omega-3 index? Like if I had never consumed fatty fish, I wasn't taking an omega-3 supplement, nothing like that, and I started today, is it one of those things like you see a pretty quick increase, or is it, as you're mentioning, is sort of a lagging indicator where it's like, okay, take it for 3 months, then we have to kind of go back and retroactively measure. But then also, as far as a benefit is concerned, like, or risk, like if someone were to have a low omega-3 profile or index, and they had that for 3 months, is that potentially equivalent to 3 months of smoking? How is it equivalent in terms of a time scale?
I have just launched my signature truffles with Thrive Market. So these are low sugar. In fact, they're actually keto friendly. They're sweetened with allulose, utilizing ethically sourced cacao, and also using hazelnut butter to give it a really well-rounded taste. So 2 different flavors. There is a hazelnut pecan crunch, which literally has a crunch to it. It's like velvety smooth, but then when you bite into it, you get the crunch in there as well. And a hazelnut mocha flavor for those that like that little coffee bite to it as well. So these things are completely low carb. There's only a tiny, tiny bit of sugar in them to begin with. The primary sweetener is allulose, and everything else is ethically sourced. So I partnered up with Thrive because we've worked on products together, but it was finally time for us to actually create a product that has the DeLauer signature on it. So that link down below saves you 30% off your whole grocery order through Thrive Market, but you're more than welcome to apply that 30% off to these truffles as well, which are priced at $10.99, so they're not too bad to begin with, but then when you apply that 30%, it's even better. Plus, you get a free $60 gift whenever you sign up with Thrive Market as well. So that link is down below in the top line of the description underneath this video.
Well, to address your first question, it takes, I would say, about 3 months. Like about 3 months is a good time range. Like let's say you're now deciding I'm going to increase my omega-3 intake through supplementation, through maybe increasing sources of, high EPA and DHA, like fatty fish, wild Alaskan salmon. You would wait about 3 months, again, because it takes about that long for your red blood cells to turn over. So you have to wait that long before you can get an omega-3 index test done. And, the question is, well, omega-3 index, why do you want it to be higher? Well, I mentioned the smoking, right? When I say higher, most of the studies are like 8% omega-3 index or more. And when I say low omega-3 index, most studies are 4% or lower. Average omega-3 index in the United States is about 4 to 5%. So we're really low. Compare that to Japan, they're like 10 or 11% omega-3 index. The average Japanese person, on average, has a 5-year increased life expectancy compared to the average American. Now, Bill Harris has done some research looking at huge sample sizes, looking at the omega-3 index and life expectancy. And people that have the 8% omega-3 index or higher have a 5-year increased life expectancy compared to people with the low omega-3 index of 4%. Now, how long does it, how much omega-3 would it take to go from 4% to 8%, right? Obviously, there's individual variation. There's omega-3s are a compound that we make in our bodies from ALA. We also have to get ALA from our diet to make them, but we have a lot of gene variations that regulate the way we metabolize it. With that said, on average, it takes people about 2 grams of omega-3 a day to go from a 4% to an 8%, and those studies have been done. So whether or not your omega-3 index is low for 3 months and then you go up to, from 4% to 8%, we don't know what effect that has, right? Like you're asking a very complicated question in terms of time kinetics and, I was low omega-3 during development and through my early adult life, but then at some point we then go to randomized controlled trials. Yeah. And that's where we also have data where it's like, okay, people that are at high risk for, let's say, myocardial infarctions or heart attack, or people that have existing cardiovascular disease, they're taking, pharmaceuticals like statins, for example, to treat it. A lot of studies have taken these populations of people that presumably do not take omega-3. Unfortunately, studies don't often measure the omega-3 index at the start of a trial. I wish they did, but they don't. It costs more money, and that's like the age-old problem with randomized controlled trials, is not measuring nutrient levels in a person before the trial starts. I think it's one of my pet peeves because, we have different gene variations that regulate the way our body metabolites nutrients, right? It's not like a drug. You don't have to measure someone's baseline levels of, let's say, a statin that you're going to give them at the start of a trial because nobody has statins at the start of a trial. But people have different, intakes of fish. They have different genes that regulate how much, let's say they eat a lot of walnuts or flax seeds, which are high in ALA, the plant omega-3, that makes them either convert it well or not well. Like, there's reasons why we need to measure these, nutrients at the start of a trial. Anyways, not done. But we do know, for example, there's been the REDUCE-IT trial. That was the big trial that looked at people with existing cardiovascular disease. And it was a 5-year trial where people were given a high dose of purified EPA. So it was just one of the omega-3s. And it was in an ethyl ester form, which we can talk about. It's not very bioavailable. And or a placebo. In this case, the placebo was mineral oil, and there's all sorts of controversy over that being actually pharmacologically active and not being a great placebo. Regardless, after the 5 years, people taking the EPA, it's called Visipa. It's a pharmaceutical prescriptive form of omega-3 that people are given, for example, with high triglycerides or with existing cardiovascular disease. Those people had a 25% decrease in heart attack, or death. Actually, it was death from heart attack and death from heart disease compared to placebo. So that was quite robust. And regardless of all the arguments, well, the placebo was, maybe the placebo was actively harmful. Even if you just look at the baseline risk reduction, it was very significant. And it was reducing triglycerides. There was effects independent of looking and comparing to placebo group that were like, wow, this is unbelievable. It's taking, like you were saying, it's taking this unhealthy group of people, giving them simply just a form of omega-3 over the course of several years, and it's like dramatically lowering their risk of dying from a heart attack, which is the number one killer in the United States. So,
in your opinion, if DHA had been in the mix too, do you think it would have even been more profound?
This is a great question, Thomas. So another trial was then underway and began. I don't remember what year it started, but the trial gave EPA and DHA to people with existing cardiovascular disease that were on a statin. And the form of this omega-3 was in free fatty acid form, which is never given to anyone, ever. So for free fatty acids, so typically the fatty acids, the DHA or EPA, are bound to a triglyceride backbone, okay? And that's the way our bodies are best at metabolizing it, okay? It's the most bioavailable. Ethyl ester is essentially when people are purifying the omega-3, getting away mercury or PCBs, things are, unfortunately found in fish. They take it off the triglyceride and they bind it to an ethanol backbone and they run it through this column that purifies it. And it's just cheaper to keep it in this ethyl, ester backbone form. Our bodies can metabolize those. They're just not as bioavailable as triglycerides. So for example, if you are taking an ethyl ester form of omega-3, like all the prescription forms are, Leveza, which is DHA and EPA, or Visipa, both of those are ethyl ester. You absolutely must take it with food, and preferably with a higher fat meal to absorb it. Like, you would not absorb much at all of ethyl ester form of omega-3 on an empty stomach. Free fatty acids are not bound to anything. And anybody that has a chemistry background, or even just scientists in general, knows, free fatty acids act like a detergent. They're lysing cells. It's kind of like a soap almost, in a way. So why, I think the reason why that form was chosen, because it can be highly bioavailable, but it can also be very irritating because you're giving your gut this free fatty acid sort of detergent-y kind of form of omega-3. So that trial was ended early because it was not shown to have a beneficial effect on any of the outcomes. And so this made the headlines, and people go, oh, it must be the DHA because they added DHA to the mix in this one. I personally don't think that's true. There's lots of other data. There weren't as big of trials, like some out of Japan, that also showed that, DHA plus EPA dramatically, reduces cardiovascular disease risk and also heart attack risk. In fact, if you look at the other big trial, the VITAL study, this was a big trial out of Joanne Manson's group that used both omega-3, vitamin D, those either alone or in combination or placebo. And if we just look at the omega-3 group, those people had about a 28% reduction in heart attack risk. So that was a secondary outcome. So the primary outcome of a trial is like, okay, we're going to design this trial. We're going to power the trial to get a statistically significant result based on, this outcome. And the outcome they based it on was all cardiovascular events, not just heart attack, everything. Okay. In that case, there was no effect of omega-3 on all statistically significant, by the way, effect. There was a trend.
Yeah.
It wasn't statistically significant in reducing every single cardiovascular event, right? But if you then just looked at, in isolation, heart attack risk, it was almost 30% lower in the group that was taking the omega-3, which included DHA and EPA versus placebo. So again, one of those things where headlines, oh, there's no effect. That's the headline. Omega-3 has no effect on cardiovascular health because of the primary outcome. There's so much nuance when it comes to these randomized controlled trials.
Definitely. And then and correct me if I'm wrong, but even as far as the mitochondria is concerned, there's a higher concentration of DHA than EPA. Am I mistaken?
No. It's interesting. I personally think that both DHA and EPA are very important to get from diet. Also, I personally take supplements, and I think supplements are a great way to increase your omega-3 index as well. So, these omega-3 fatty acids are well known for their quote unquote anti-inflammatory effects. And a lot of that, there's a lot of metabolites from DHA and EPA that are different. There's resolvins, these resolve inflammation, so you're not getting that inflammatory cycle. There's the myrisins, they do something similar. There's the specialized pro-mediating mediators, the SPMs. And these are all involved in resolving inflammation, in lowering inflammation. And they're sort of different from EPA and DHA. A lot of these are coming from DHA. EPA also directly affects inflammation. So it's decreasing the production of prostaglandins, which are inflammatory mediators, leukotrienes, for example. So EPA also has a very direct role in inflammation. And that's kind of this anti-inflammatory role of omega-3. However, as you mentioned, DHA accumulates in mitochondria. These are the energy-producing organelles inside of our cell, very important for, energy. They're important for aging, important for muscle function, performance, cognition, everything, right? But DHA also accumulates. It's also very, very highly found in all of our cell membranes. So we're talking about in our neurons, in cells, in our muscle. And what DHA is doing in that role is different than its anti-inflammatory role. It's regulating what's called cell membrane fluidity, the way our cells are, sort of malleable, and the stiffness of them, the flexibility of them. Why is this important? I mean, it's important for many, many reasons. We could go hours and hours talking about this, and I'll spare you. But just generally speaking, sort of 1,000-mile high sort of overview of it, it's important for transporters and receptors that are embedded in that cell membrane that are transporting nutrients like magnesium into our cells or, glucose into our cells. They're important for receptors, like, for example, on neurons, talking about serotonin receptors, dopamine receptors. When you don't have enough DHA, if it's deficient, and a lot of studies have been done in animal studies with this, looking at deficiency of DHA, you're screwing up neurotransmission, dopamine, serotonin neurotransmission, because the receptor structure and function is changed because of that cell. It's stiffer. It's stiffer. It's not the right, it doesn't have the right flexibility. And so it affects so many physiological processes. And then glucose transport's affected. So you're not getting enough glucose across the blood-brain barrier, because the transporters, and this has been shown in animal studies, the glucose transporters are completely disrupted when there's a DHA deficiency, at least in rodents. So it's very important. I think DHA is very important for that reason. And as we get into maybe talking a little bit more about some of the sort of novel and I would say less well-studied part of omega-3, which is in the muscle. The cardiovascular, I mean, omega-3 is one of the most well-studied nutrients like of all time. I mean, like we know so much about it. You know, there's so many people that have researched it over the decades. But I think there's a really important role for DHA. And I do think some of this has gotten a little bit lost in the headline, you know, where it's like, oh, the EPA is so important. The EPA is what reduced the heart attack, you know, risk by, 25%, or the death from a heart attack, I guess, by 25%. In that big study, the REDUCE-IT trial.
Yeah, but it's looking at it in practically an echo chamber. I mean, it's not like factoring in, like when we look at, cardiovascular function, we look at longevity in the first place, like a lot of roads lead back to mitochondria in the first place and lead back to that membrane fluidity and all these things we're talking about. So maybe in isolation, when you look at it like that, you can say, yes, EPA is powerful and is important, but it just seems like we're missing this whole piece.
Yeah, it's great. So mitochondria have two membranes, and DHA accumulates in both of those membranes, and those membranes are essential for the health of our mitochondria, for how they're producing energy, for how things are like 99% of all the proteins in the mitochondria are not made in the mitochondria. We have our own mitochondrial genome. We make some mitochondrial proteins, but the majority of them have to be transported into the mitochondria through a whole active transport mechanism, which requires a functional membrane, and DHA is part of that. And DHA highly accumulates in mitochondrial membranes. And so, there's been tons and tons of animal research, which is more preclinical stuff, looking at, function of mitochondria. What happens when you make an animal deficient in DHA? It's, messes up mitochondrial function. And, mitochondria is very important for the way we age. It's important for our brain function. It's important to produce energy, just steady state energy, but also like during exercise, right? So there's a lot of reasons why DHA are very important. And I think the main thing also is avoiding that deficiency or insufficiency. So as I mentioned, one of the top 6 preventable causes of death, there's other data out there showing that it's 99% of people in the United States have inadequate omega-3 intake. 99, it's so high, and 80% globally or something like that, where, people are not eating enough fish, or they're not supplementing enough with omega-3, whatever, there's, you can find reasons why people don't want to take fish. They might be afraid of the mercury. They might be afraid of contaminants. But I'll tell you this, there was a huge push decades ago by OBGYNs for pregnant women to avoid fish because of the contamination and the mercury. And I think that had just rippling effects, negative rippling effects, because omega-3 is so important for brain development. DHA is so important for brain development. And women were just not eating fish, and they weren't supplementing. So they were essentially not getting much omega-3 in their diet. There's now been several studies that have come out that have found that the developing fetus, which is probably the most sensitive to mercury toxicity, actually benefits even more, and the omega-3 is protective against the mercury toxicity. In fact, there's been studies looking at development. So I think it was 1 year, cognitive development at 1 year and 7 years or something like that, where they look at cognitive development over time of the child, and they looked at the mother's omega-3 status. And they also looked at a biomarker, which was mercury. The higher the mother's mercury was, the more intelligent, or the higher their child scored on intelligent tests. Now, does that mean mercury is increasing intelligence? No. Mercury was biomarking omega-3 in fish intake, right? So clearly the mercury wasn't harming intelligence at all, because, it was higher in the mothers that had children with higher intelligent quotient scores and stuff like that.
Wow.
Right.
It's like I've seen over the last 5 years, 3 years really, online, this, I'm going to call it weird, a weird resistance to omega-3s. I'm not sure where it's coming from. I've always kind of been in your camp. I've always been pretty high dose, relatively speaking, 2 to 3 grams per day. And especially when I was much lower carb, then I would probably go even higher just naturally, just based on what I was consuming. And it's been interesting to see. I don't know where it's coming from. And every time I talk about it, there's resistance from the heavy metal side. There's this and that. I'm a little bit mind boggled by it. But pivoting really quick to something that you touched on really quick that I think a lot of people are probably wondering about is, does the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio even matter that much anymore? Or is it more just about your absolute values of omega-3s?
Yeah, there's a lot of opinions in this, and I wouldn't say they're necessarily evidence-based opinions. So far, I've really tried hard, objectively to figure this out. And from all of my reading in the literature, it seems as though the problem is not getting enough omega-3 is what really matters. So getting more of that omega-3 is what is paramount, essentially. Like, that's the most important thing. Omega-6, there's lots of healthy sources of omega-6, nuts, for example, right? I mean, and I mentioned, DHA in cell membranes, like there's an even higher concentration of omega-6 in cell membranes that's required. It's the same thing, membrane fluidity. It's required for the function of your membranes to work properly. So I don't think people realize it, but like omega-6 is actually very important. The problem is that, people are just going out to eat and buying foods that are being fried over and over in vegetable oil, which is high in omega-6. And so it's like, okay, well, people are getting a lot of omega-6 that isn't even necessarily a good form of it because it's being oxidized, like, several times over, probably. And so, so they're not getting omega-6 from the right sources. They're not getting a good source of it. And on top of that, they're like not getting enough omega-3. So I think the thing to really focus on is omega-3. And I just haven't been convinced because, there's all this data out there I've seen where it's like, then you give people omega-6 and they either don't do worse than, like, for example, a high saturated fat diet, or they have improved outcomes. And so it's a little bit, if you just look at the data, it's kind of like, that doesn't, interesting. It's against what you hear a lot in the popular media. Yeah. I personally don't eat vegetable oil. I don't take it in omega-6 in that form, but I do eat omega-6 from nuts, walnuts. I mean, people are scared of eating nuts because it's high in omega-6. And there's so many micronutrients that are important in nuts. I don't think it's really that I think that people are focused on the wrong thing. Again, it's that mentality of, oh no, that thing that's bad for me, that toxic thing I didn't know about, here's the secret I'm in, I can learn about. When really the secret is you're just not eating the right food. Yeah. Like, you just need to increase your intake of omega-3 and, things sort of get better from there. The omega-3 the thing also that's really interesting. I was talking about it being important for brain development. It's also been shown to increase, like if you get into the 2 gram a day per range, which is what you need if you're, let's say, on the low omega-3 index, 4%, and you want to get into the high, 8%, right? That same amount, about 2 grams a day, is what has been shown to increase plasma levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that brain-derived neurotrophic factor, it plays an important role in muscle, helps with muscle repair, but also crosses the blood-brain barrier. It gets into the brain. Hugely beneficial for neuroplasticity, which is the ability of your brain, your neurons in your brain to sort of adapt and make new connections based on environmental changes and stimuli. So as we get older, our brains become, you've probably heard this, less plastic. That's essentially referring to neuroplasticity. So our brains are adapting as well to not only just changes like learning new things and being able to learn things easier, but like just changes neurophysiological that are happening in our neurochemistry and in our brain. So neuroplasticity plays an important role in all that, like adaptation. It also affects mental health, right? So if you can't adapt to a changing environment, it can become quite depressing. So neuroplasticity plays a huge role in depression as well. But then brain-derived neurotrophic factor also helps existing neurons survive. It helps grow new neurons in certain regions of the brain. It's called neurogenesis. And it helps make new connections between the neurons. So you're like, basically improving your cognition and memory, learning, everything's improved. Omega-3 affects that as well. So brain effects. And then if you're interested in going into the muscle, I think this is a whole new area.
Yeah, I think we should touch on it for a little bit though, because you caught my interest there. I had no idea that BDNF played a role in in the muscle. Like, I mean, you think of it literally the name brain, like you think, okay, this is only affecting the brain. So yeah, enlighten me. How is it affecting the muscle?
Well, it plays a role in like repair of damage and stuff. It's funny because your muscles make BDNF. In fact, the more intense exercise, the more exercise intensity, the greater the BDNF response. So the more your muscles are making it in a way. And so because you are putting stress on your muscles are adapting and they're like, holy crap, I got to, repair. This is stress. This is causing damage. I need to repair that damage. And so it's a stress response, but it just so happens that BDNF also gets into circulation and crosses the blood-brain barrier and gets into the brain as well. So, I would say that I'm not like the biggest expert on how and exactly what ways BDNF is repairing muscle, but I know that it plays a role in muscle repair.
Is it correlated with the levels of lactate? Because I'm
Yes.
familiar with, like, I'm a huge fan of BFR training, and like it was for the longest time, it was possibly placeboing myself, but like I would notice that when I would do some kind of BFR training and have a high level, and I was measuring lactate for a while too, and just getting weird about it. I swear, like on days, we got to the point where on days that I would film that I had to have like a lot of mental acuity and like be more articulate. Days I did BFR training and probably had high circulating levels of BDNF, I felt clear. But then it just came into this thing where it just became sort of regimented for me. Like I just feel like I'm getting this benefit that's affecting my brain from BFR that I wasn't getting from anything else other than like super high intensity work. Like just casually going for a walk, Sure, I'd feel good, but I wasn't getting that same effect.
Yes. So this kind of pivots into another topic, but lactate is, a lot of people have thought about it as this like waste metabolite. It's like, people think it's responsible for muscle soreness, and that's kind of not entirely true, right? No. I mean, it's like the hydrogen ions and stuff. But lactate, you do generate it when you're doing a very physically intensive type of exercise, right? When your mitochondria can't produce enough energy to keep up, right? So you're basically your muscles are like, okay, I'm going to use glucose in this really quick way as this energy source, and it makes lactate as a byproduct. And it doesn't require any, oxygen. It doesn't require, it happens very fast, much, much faster. So when you start to get into that higher intensity exercise, we're talking, it's a spectrum. So, lactate is at any point, we have it in the millimolar range in our body. So like usually I would say baseline levels, most people it's around 1 millimolar, somewhere 0.9 to 1 or something like that. Just normal, steady state, not exercising, no BFR, nothing like that, right? And so we have a pretty high amount of lactate actually circulating in our body at any time. When you start to then get your exercise up, particularly when you start to go into that 80%, max heart rate zone where you're in the high intensity zone, right? You're doing intense exercise. You're still aerobic too. Like it's not like purely anaerobic. You're not going all out, but you are not able to hold a conversation. You're working hard. Depending on the person, your lactate goes up. I mean, it can be like 8 millimolar. And then the more intense you go, when you start to go to submaximal and maximal, I mean, you're talking 15, 20 millimolar. I mean, there's individual variation, by the way, in that as well. Now, why is that, right? Why? Well, for one, obviously your muscles you're putting a lot of stress on your muscles, and they're using glucose in the way that makes a lot of lactate. But lactate itself is not only it's being used again by your muscle to make energy. It's a very energetically favorable source of energy, very much like ketone bodies, like beta hydroxybutyrate. It's very energetically favorable. So your body can easily use lactate. Your mitochondria can use it as energy. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that lactate, it's a chemical messenger. So it gets released into your circulation, and it gets sucked up like predominantly a lot by the brain. And human studies have shown this. Radio labeled it, showing it going in the brain. And it's a signaling molecule that increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor. This has been shown. I mean, it's absolutely involved in signaling to the body, to the brain, to the muscles to increase BDNF. So part of that BDNF that we just talked about is happening through lactate. Lactate's the signal. It's the communication way. It's the way your body's going, I'm stressed. This is a stressful workout you're doing. Please respond to it. And it responds by increasing brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So lactate is directly correlated with that. And all those studies have been done. In fact, you can inject sodium lactate into people and increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor. You can also increase other neurotransmitters. So it increases norepinephrine, increases serotonin. In fact, during exercise, so the lactate that's produced during exercise is going into the brain, and that's fueling. Your brain works harder during exercise too, just like your muscles do, just like your heart does, your brain does too. And we were kind of talking a little bit about the mental part of intense exercise. Well, your brain works harder and it's fueled by lactate, and the lactate's increasing norepinephrine. And that really helps with the focus and the attention and that drive, it also helps with the motivation because you have
in
serotonin.
The zone, literally.
In the zone, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's been fMRI studies in humans. I can't remember I think it might have been a Norwegian group that did this study. It's sounding, I think it was years ago, maybe 2017 or 2016 or something like that. But, just phenomenal work showing lactate as a signaling molecule that's responsible for, basically boosting neurotransmitter synthesis, boosting brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which of course has beneficial effects on brain aging, on cognition, on muscle repair. Lactate's being used, and this is where a lot of work has come out of George Brooks, who actually is the godfather of the lactate shuttle, what was called hypothesis at the time. This is lactate being shuttled from exercise. You generate it from exercise, and it's being shuttled to other tissues and used for other sources of energy and for signaling molecules and stuff like that. Well, he's done a lot of work also looking at traumatic brain injury and how lactate can help with people with traumatic brain injury. And part of that is because, as I mentioned, lactate is very energetically favorable. In other words, it's used to make energy. Lactate crosses over the blood-brain barrier, so it gets into the brain through the MCT transporters. These are the monocarboxylate transporters. They're the same ones that beta-hydroxybutyrate's going into. They both go through the same transporter. It gets into the brain, and neurons are using it for energy. So neurons actually use a lot of lactate for energy because our astrocytes in our brain, which are supporting cells, they're mostly glycolytic. In other words, they're mostly just using glucose and making lactate. They make lactate, and the lactate gets shipped out, and neurons take it up. And they're using it as a very energetic. It takes less energy to use lactate than glucose.
Yes.
And so your neurons prefer that in a way because it's energetically favorable. So when you're boosting the lactate amount in the brain, this allows for something called the glucose sparing effect. So your neurons can spare glucose. Now, why is that important? It's important because glucose then goes into another biochemical pathway called the pentose phosphate pathway. This allows glucose to be used to make precursors, NADPH, for glutathione synthesis. Glutathione is the brain's major antioxidant. When you have a TBI, glucose, a lot of times glucose utilization by neurons is also disrupted, but glutathione becomes hugely important. Hugely, because there's a huge bolus of oxidative stress in the brain with an insult like that. And so glucose sparing allows that glucose to just boost that synthesis of the glutathione immediately, right? So this is where the research has been done. So giving TBI patients sodium lactate improves the outcomes, so the Glasgow scores. This is the measurement of their progression, I guess. So people with the TBI have a much better outcome if they're getting sodium lactate infusion versus saline placebo infusion. I think, this is where my conjecture comes in, that has a lot to do with the BDNF going up. This has not been shown, of course, in those specific studies, but we talk about BDNF, it's increasing BDNF. It's an energetically favorable source of energy and probably causing the glucose sparing, allowing the brain to make more glutathione. Now, some of these studies have been done in animal models of TBI, so mechanistically worked out in a way, but hasn't been directly shown in humans. I don't know that you ever can show that necessarily, right? But for all those purists out there that always, randomized controlled trial has to show it before you believe it, I just, don't know that we'll ever have that. So at some point you have to connect the dots, right? So, long-winded answer to the lactate question, but I think it's one of the reasons why high-intensity workouts are so important to me and why I'm with you on that. Like I use them as like I do a 10-minute, high intensity interval, workout, and it boosts my mental acuity. It boosts my motivation. I feel better. I'm definitely on top of my game. And there's been studies showing 10 minutes of HIIT improves cognition. That's all it takes, 10 minutes.
I mean, I definitely think we should do a deep dive on that topic entirely. And I think, and just for the essence of even this video, you have a protocol, and we can link out to it down below. That's like a specific kind of protocol for increasing BDNF. Maybe just a quick blurb on that, because we'll link out to it down below and we'll do a separate topic on high intensity. But I want to make sure that we shout that out too, because it's so important and relevant to what we're talking about.
Yeah. So I just released a BDNF protocol document, which is essentially, it's protocols everywhere, anything from exercise, the intensity and duration that have been, shown in the literature to increase BDNF in humans, as well as other lifestyle factors. So omega-3, another one, and everything from dose, to duration, and other things like polyphenols, flavonoids, heat stress also has been shown to increase BDNF. So again, temperature, duration, protocols there that are in the literature, as well as things that I do. So it's part of that document, like my BDNF protocols that I do to increase BDNF. And so that's at bdnfprotocols.com, and it's a free guide that people can get.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll link out down to that below. And to bring it back full circle, back to omega-3s, do you think that omega-3s have an impact or sort of an interplay with BDNF as well? So, because I know there's evidence for omega-3s and muscle anabolism and obviously insulin sensitivity and whatnot, possibly post-workout, possibly, glycogen resynthesis, all these things that are important if you're working out. Do you think there's an interplay there with omega-3s and BDNF and kind of how they possibly intertwine at some point?
Well, omega-3 increases BDNF. So, I mean, that would be a direct interaction.
Direct effect,
right?
Yes.
A direct effect. So, in that regards, yeah. And then omega-3 itself, so you're talking about in the muscle, this is where the DHA, I think, shines in a way, but it's to be determined because most of the studies are done with both.
So hard.
There's studies showing that omega-3 affects performance. It affects muscle mass. And I think what has become highly intriguing to me over the last, I would say, couple of years is the role of omega-3 in muscle in terms of it being possibly anabolic, certainly in preventing disuse atrophy, which is, that is a big problem for a large percentage of the population. And this research still is in its infancy. Chris McGlory's Dr. Chris McGlory, I did an interview with him a couple of months ago. He's one of the leaders in this area. He trained with Stu Phillips, Kevin Tipton. So, he's got like this, he's trained with a lot of these big guys in exercise physiology. But some of his research has indicated that, and it's very important, again, going back to like the way a randomized controlled trial is designed makes the difference, right? He's shown that high dose omega-3, so in the range of 4 to 5 grams, can cut disuse atrophy essentially in half. So in other words, you're losing 50% less muscle mass in an injury event. But in this event, it wasn't an injury, but they put a cast on people. They're doing healthy people instead of older people because it's a little more catastrophic to lose muscle mass when you're older. But I mean, it's a huge difference. And his lab isn't the only one to show it, right? But what's important is they had to preload these participants for 4 weeks to get that effect. Because Chris thinks it's the effect it takes about a month for omega-3 to accumulate in the cell membranes, in mitochondrial membranes, in the membranes in muscle cells, right? It takes a month. The anti-inflammatory effect, those resolvins, the maricins, those things we were talking about, that's immediate. Those, like you take an omega-3 supplement and in the next few hours, those things are in your circulation, like pretty quick. But for it to accumulate in your cell membranes, let's say you're someone who is a low omega-3 person, you have a low omega-3 index, it takes a month for it to accumulate. And so if you do a randomized controlled trial and at the start, you give them omega-3 and then you're doing your experiments, your disuse atrophy, it's going to, like at the end of your trial, let's say your trial is a month long. Okay, now it's in their membranes. So preloading was essential. In other words, it had to have, they had to have gotten their omega-3, dose for a month before the actual disuse trial started. I think this has huge relevance. So personally, like Chris has talked about it being anabolic. He doesn't quite know. He thinks there's a mitochondrial component in there involved, but also just it seems to be sensitizing muscle cells to amino acids. Now, is that so important for someone like Thomas, who, you are very, fastidious about getting your protein intake and your requirements, and based on how much resistance training you're doing and your activity, like you're doing those calculations and making sure you're getting enough, right? But a lot of people are not, especially older people. And older people that aren't even doing resistance training, right? So if you can find a way to sensitize muscle to things like leucine, which are an important signal for muscle protein synthesis, that is low-hanging fruit, like a supplement, that not only is beneficial for the muscle, but for other things, right? Cardiovascular disease risk is reduced, BDNF, like how is that not a win-win situation, right? With it's, the way I like to think about omega-3 is it's pharmacological profile of like a drug, right? I mean, doctors are prescribing it for people with high triglycerides. It's got a pharmacological profile of a drug, but the risk profile of a nutrient, right? So, and it doesn't take much, like you said, 2 grams a day to go from 4% to 8%. That's a pretty, I would say, conservative way to get your omega-3 index high is like, okay, 2 grams a day. You don't have to go to the, again, the disuse atrophy studies are at higher doses, but that's only because he hasn't done a dose response trial to see if those same effects can be found at lower doses like 2 grams. We don't know. Maybe they can. Maybe they require higher doses. We don't know. Again, it's early in its infancy. So the omega-3 in the muscle, is it also increasing BDNF in the muscle at that dose? We know it's increasing BDNF in plasma. That's probably that's going to the muscle. It's going to the brain. So yes, there's an interaction between omega-3 and BDNF, but there's also just an independent effect of omega-3 on muscle health, on muscle biology, on disuse atrophy that I think is hugely important for many people that are sedentary, that don't get enough protein, or even people that are physically active and do get enough protein. I still think it's important.
Is there much risk for someone to say, well, if 2 grams is good and 4 to 5 grams is good for disuse atrophy, I'm going to screw it. I'm going to take 4 or 5 grams. Like, is there really much of an issue if they wanted to just say, hey, I'm going to go high dose? I'm sure if they went, starting to go to mega dose categories, you're starting to go 10 plus grams, like some people recommend. I'm sure you could find some issues there. But, if you're looking at the 4 to 5 gram range, is that generally an okay place to be?
So, I personally do experimentally high doses of omega-3. I'm more in the 4 to 6 grams a day range. There have been a couple of studies. Now, some of those trials, like the Visipa trial, and then there was another trial where there was some subgroup analysis done. These are all people on statins. They're people with a cardiovascular disease risk profile. Okay, keep that in mind. When they're taking high doses of purified EPA, that is in ethyl ester form, a very small percentage of those people seem to get arrhythmias. However, they also have a lower stroke risk, which is the biggest problem of an arrhythmia is you worry about stroke risk, right? So it's kind of like, well, at the end of the day, even though they're having a very small percentage of people is having a higher risk of arrhythmia, they're still have a lower stroke risk profile.
Yeah.
It's not really known if it's just the high dose of pure ethyl ester form that's doing it. Like, I haven't seen that yet in a triglyceride form study.
Gotcha.
Right. So there's a lot of unknown questions, and again, it's not everyone. It's a very small percentage of people. Is there a gene? Is there some sort of gene, dose interaction with the ethyl ester form? There's a lot of possibilities there. So there is something to consider when you get to the 4 gram, range in people with existing cardiovascular disease on different drugs and, that we just don't quite understand. The reason I'm not as worried about that is because they still have a lower stroke risk profile. If that makes sense.
No, it makes total sense.
Yeah.
And, to kind of wrap it up with a bow, like if someone's shopping for an omega-3 supplement, one thing that I've noticed is that ones that are in a triglycerol form, they're proud about it and they put it on their label. However, it's not always easy to find ones that are in, if you're in ethyl ester form, like you have to kind of look. So what are sort of your guidelines when someone's shopping for an omega-3? You don't have to name brands, like shopping for an omega-3, like what are the red flags? What should they look for? And also lastly, like, what's your take on cod liver oil?
Okay. So I think there's some good guidelines that can be followed with respect to finding a decent omega-3 supplement. Personally, I think that triglyceride form is probably better. I think it's incorporated into, there's some animal evidence that it's incorporated into cell membranes better than ethyl ester form, which makes sense. But again, that's animal evidence. So my personal preference, I do think that triglyceride form is better for that reason, also because it's more bioavailable. However, with that said, there are some people that unless their doctor prescribes it to them, they will not take it. And doctors prescribe Leveza, which is DHA EPA. It's pure, it's not oxidized. The concentration that says it's on the bottle is the concentration there. It's ethyl ester form. If you take it with a meal, you take it with like a higher fat meal, like, maybe some eggs in the morning, avocados, things like that. It's a lot more bioavailable. So it's not like, I would say that if you have a parent or like a friend, whatever, a person that's like, no, unless my doctor prescribes it, I'm not going to take it. Well, Leveza is really a great, a doctor can prescribe that. That's kind of like my go-to for the doctor prescription form. The Visipa is just EPA. I think DHA is important. So Leveza, I think, is like the prescription form that is, again, if you're someone that just needs a doctor to prescribe it, I think that's the great way. If you want to go out and buy a supplement, I think that finding the triglyceride form, you can find it, or you can always just email the company and they'll tell you if it's not like available. But I do think that it is good to look at third-party testing sites. And International Fish Oil Standards is one. Consumer Lab is another. I really like IFOS, although it's a lot more work sifting through their data. They do have a lot of brands on there where they measure important factors. And I think those factors are the actual concentration of DHA and EPA, because a lot of times these aren't regulated. So the concentration can be much, much lower than, I don't think I've ever seen it much higher. It's usually much lower than stated on the bottle. So the concentration, you want to make sure you're getting a good concentrated form. And then you want the total oxidation to be like on the lower end. I like lower than 6. I think definitely lower than 10. Like, you don't want to go above 10. But if you can get lower than 6 total oxidation, that's where I think it's really, so the combination of the triglyceride form, lower total oxidation, lower than 6. Most of these supplements are lower in mercury, PCBs. That data is also there. So you can look for everything on that site. There's quite a few brands in the US, there's brands in Europe and Canada that you can find with all those profiles that are there.
Should you refrigerate it after you open it?
Yes.
Okay, that was...
Yes, so omega-3 is prone to oxidation, and that oxidation process is a lot lower with refrigeration. Yeah. So, and it's always best to buy it direct from consumer as well. Like, it's not sitting around on Amazon warehouse for like who knows how long. Yeah. So I think that's another important thing. But Consumer Lab is they also do some third-party testing on a lot of omega-3 supplements, and including ones that are readily available to the masses of people, like things that are found in like Costco, for example. And you can find decent, like even I think the Kirkland brand of omega-3 wasn't that bad actually. I was like, oh, this is something like it's more affordable. There's people that have different, there's different things that are important to them, right? Like supplements are expensive. And as you start to add them up, you do need to kind of like balance a lot of things out there. So I think you can still find good brands that aren't going to cost your arm and leg to get. So Consumer Lab, I think, is a good resource for that, because they do measure a lot of like readily available supplements that aren't so expensive. And then they measure things like oxidation and concentration of EPA and DHA. So that's another really good, I would say, resource.
Okay. Cod liver oil. Just kind of curious there, because obviously it's not insanely high in omega-3s, but you're also getting vitamin A, vitamin D, you're kind of getting that. The reason vitamin A with vitamin D is sort of you're not depleting that bioavailable retinol A, kind of things like that might happen with maybe too much synthetic vitamin D. So not to go into a different category of vitamin D, but like I'm curious because I've previously have been a fan of cod liver oil. I still take it occasionally, but not as much as I do just a direct EPA DHA. What's your take on that?
My take is if you're going to take cod liver oil, it's my only concern with that is the vitamin A level is so much. I had done the calculation at some point, but I don't remember how much fold higher than vitamin D, certainly than the omega-3 in there, that if you wanted to only get your vitamin D source from cod liver oil, you're going to be getting like too much vitamin A, which is definitely something that can be toxic at high doses, right? So can vitamin D. But so it's kind of like that thing where it's like, oh, I'm going to take a little teaspoon just as a little bit of each of this. But like, that's not going to be my omega-3 source. That's probably not going to be my full vitamin D source, depending on your age and how much sun exposure you get. But it probably won't be, you have to get a blood test to confirm, but likely it won't be your only source of vitamin D, or it shouldn't be because you'll be getting a lot of vitamin A, a lot. So I don't think it's necessarily bad to take, there's, you can take a little teaspoonful of it, whatever, just to get a little bit of each, but like, I think you need to go to another source for omega-3 because you won't, getting 2 grams from that will get you vitamin A toxicity, like too much.
Yeah, there's not a ton of omega-3s in it. I just get a lot of questions on it because I've been a proponent of cod liver oil used intermittently. I for example, I'll use it, I don't know, maybe once every 1 to 2 weeks, right? Just as to round out my nutritional profile. It's like I have naturally pretty decent vitamin D levels, probably just from my diet and sun exposure. So it's like I'm not trying to jack it up super high. But anyway, that's going off on a tangent. But I wanted to hear your take on that. Well, Dr. Patrick, where can everyone find you?
Well, I have a YouTube channel, Found My Fitness. I think that's a great place they can find me. Also, website, foundmyfitness.com, and then, podcast on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, all Found My Fitness. So everything is Found My Fitness. That's the place where people can find me and find BDNF protocols is bdnfprotocols.com if they want to find the protocols on increasing their BDNF.
Perfect. Well, we'll link out to all that stuff below and right on. As always, keep it locked in. See you tomorrow.